Some leaders change the world with their words. Others do it with their silence. Ibrahim Traoré didn't say a single word at the IMF meeting. He simply stood up and walked toward the exit. But this silent protest created an earthquake effect in the global economy. In the Grand Conference Hall of the IMF headquarters, one of Washington, D.C.'s iconic buildings, the annual spring meetings were in progress. Finance ministers, central bank governors, and economic experts from around the world had gathered to make decisions that would shape the future of the global economy. At the front of the stage, IMF President Kristalina Georgieva was at the podium, detailing a new debt package for African countries. There was a heaviness in the hall. The figures, graphs, and conditions shown on the projection were harbingers of a new era of economic dependency for many African countries. "This new economic stability package," said Georgieva with a confident voice, "is critically important for African countries to enter a path of sustainable development. Of course, these credits will have certain conditions: cutting public expenditures, privatization of state institutions, liberalization of markets." In the rows of the hall sat the Burkina Faso delegation. At their head was the country's young and charismatic leader, Ibrahim Traoré. In his military uniform, he stood out among the elegant suits of other leaders. The expression on his face was stern, his eyes following every movement of Georgieva. Economy Minister Adama Ouedraogo, sitting next to Traoré, noticed his boss was tense. "Are you all right, Mr. President?" he whispered. Traoré didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the conditions appearing on the screen. Article 7. Participating countries will give priority to international companies in the exploitation of their natural resources. Georgieva continued her speech. "This program offers long-term solutions to Africa's problems. As the IMF, we believe in the continent's potential and—" At that moment, there was a movement from the back rows of the hall. Ibrahim Traoré had slowly risen to his feet. All eyes turned to him. Traoré didn't say anything. He just collected the documents in front of him, removed his microphone, and began walking calmly toward the exit. The hall was plunged into stunned silence. Georgieva cut her speech short, trying to understand what was happening. The other members of the Burkina Faso delegation looked at each other in momentary confusion. Then Ouedraogo also stood up and followed his leader. One by one, all the representatives of Burkina Faso began to leave the hall. Georgieva leaned into the microphone. "Mr. Traoré, is there a problem?" she asked, unable to hide the surprise in her voice. Traoré didn't stop, didn't even look back. The silence in the hall was broken only by the sound of his determined steps. When he reached the door, he paused for just a moment, scanned the entire hall, and then walked out. The hall suddenly filled with a murmur. Delegates whispered to each other. Journalists reached for their phones. This unexpected protest had changed the entire atmosphere of the meeting. Georgieva tried to regain control of the hall. "Friends, please remain calm. Let's continue our meeting." But no one was listening to her anymore. All eyes were on the door, all thoughts focused on the same question. Why had Traoré walked out? The same day at the Burkina Faso embassy in Washington, D.C., Traoré and his team were holding an emergency meeting. Diplomatic circles and the media were eager to learn the reason behind the dramatic exit from the IMF meeting. "Mr. President," said Foreign Minister Jean-Baptiste Zongo with a concerned voice, "this exit could have significant consequences. The IMF might suspend our credit programs. Western countries might impose sanctions." Traoré was calmly looking out the window. "We already knew this would happen, Jean-Baptiste. The IMF's conditions were not a solution for us, but a trap." "But what's our alternative?" asked Zongo, with a hint of desperation in his voice. "Our country faces serious economic problems. Our infrastructure is inadequate. Our health system is weak. Education—" Traoré turned to his minister, a determined expression in his eyes. "Alternative? That's exactly what we need to discuss. The Western economic model has made us dependent. The IMF's conditions would make us even more dependent. We must create our own model." Everyone in the room was listening to him attentively. Traoré opened a file on his desk and took out a document. "Here is our alternative, the Pan-African Economic Cooperation Model." The ministers approached the file with curiosity. Traoré began to explain his plan. "This model envisions direct trade between African countries, a common currency, resource sharing, and technology transfer. Without being dependent on Western financial institutions and their conditions, we can manage our own resources ourselves. Ouedraogo was examining the file with astonishment. This, this is a very bold plan, Mr. President. But is it realistic? Will other African countries join? Traoré smiled. They already are, Adama. For the past 6 months, we've been having secret talks with 12 African countries. All of them showed interest in this model. We were just waiting for the right time, and that time is today. Zongo was still concerned. What will the West's reaction be? The IMF, the World Bank, major economies? Of course they will oppose it, said Traoré with a determined voice, because this model threatens their economic control over Africa. But it's time for us to declare our independence, not just politically, but economically as well. Traoré looked at his team, a fiery determination in his eyes. Tomorrow we will hold an international press conference in Ouagadougou. We will announce the Pan-African Economic Cooperation Model to the world, and this will be just the beginning. The next day, a major press conference was held in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. The world media had gathered to hear the explanation for Traoré's dramatic exit from the IMF. When Traoré took the podium, there was silence in the hall. The young leader, dressed in his usual military uniform, looked at the journalist with a determined expression. Yesterday, I left the IMF meeting, he began his speech. This was not a spontaneous decision. It was a step I had been thinking about, planning for a long time. Because the economic model that the IMF proposes for Africa doesn't liberate us. It makes us more dependent. Journalists were rapidly taking notes. Traoré raised his voice. Today, I want to present to you a new vision, the Pan-African Economic Cooperation Model. This model envisions a system where African countries manage their own resources, trade among themselves, use a common currency, and share technology. The hall was filled with surprise and curiosity. Traoré picked up a document from the table and showed it. In this document are the details of the model. 12 African countries have already indicated their support for this model. And today from here, I call on all African countries. Come, let's build our economic future together. A CNN reporter asked the first question. Mr. President, does this model completely reject institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank? Is this the end of economic relations with the West? Traoré responded calmly. We don't intend to cut our relations with any country or institution, but these relations must be between equals. The West's economic institutions approached us not as partners, but as masters. This is no longer acceptable. A BBC reporter directed another question. What is the chance of success for this model? Economic cooperation between African countries has been attempted in the past, but it wasn't successful. The reason past initiatives failed, said Traoré, was external interventions and internal betrayals. But now there is a new generation of leaders in Africa. Leaders who believe in independence, dignity, and self-sufficiency. And most importantly, our people are now awake. They are aware of their own potential. An Al Jazeera reporter asked curiously, the idea of a common currency is very interesting. Does this mean an exit from the franc zone? What will France's reaction be? Traoré's face became serious. The franc zone is an economic relic of colonialism. Yes, in the long term, we envision creating Africa's own currency. This won't be easy, but it's a necessary step. France's reaction? They will think of their own interests. We are thinking of Africa's interests. When the press conference ended, the world media left with a big story. Africa declares economic independence. Traoré challenges the global financial system, Pan-African economic model, the beginning of a new era. In Washington, D.C., at the IMF headquarters, an emergency meeting was being held. President Georgieva had gathered with high-level economists and representatives from Western countries. This is unacceptable, said the U.S. Treasury Secretary angrily. Traoré is trying to upend the entire economic order. We must stop this plan. Georgieva looked concerned. The problem is, Traoré is not alone. 12 African countries are with him, and judging by social media, he's receiving great support among African peoples. The French representative interjected nervously. An exit from the franc zone is out of the question. This is a direct threat to France's national interests. We should impose economic sanctions. Georgieva nodded thoughtfully. Sanctions could make Traoré even more popular. We need a more subtle approach. Perhaps by making some concessions, we can bring him back to the table. Concessions? Asked the British representative with surprise. This sets a dangerous precedent. Other countries might make similar demands. Georgieva took a deep breath. What's the alternative? To set all of Africa against us? This would be a disaster for the global economy. The meeting continued with lengthy discussions. Finally, a strategy was determined. Instead of directly rejecting Traoré's plan, to weaken it through dialogue, to offer economic incentives to separate some countries from the coalition, and most importantly, to start a smear campaign through the media. Returning to Ouagadougou, Traoré began to implement the first steps of his plan. He organized a summit bringing together the leaders of 12 African countries. At this meeting, the Pan-African Economic Cooperation Council was officially established. At the press statement after the meeting, the president of Mali said, "Today we are opening a new page in Africa's economic history. From now on, we will manage our own resources in line with our own interests." The president of Senegal added these words, "This is not a movement against the West. This is a step for Africa to realize its own potential. We are open to cooperation with all countries of the world, but now on equal terms." These developments resonated widely around the world. On social media platforms in Africa, a big wave of support formed for Traoré and his vision. The hashtag #Economic Freedom for Africa became a global trend. However, a different narrative dominated in the Western media. Many newspapers and television channels described Traoré as radical, unrealistic, and even dangerous. Economic experts claimed that the Pan-African model was doomed to fail. "This model will isolate Africa from the global economy," wrote the Wall Street Journal. "The result will be more poverty and instability." The Financial Times presented this analysis. Traoré's vision is a utopia disconnected from economic realities. African countries cannot develop without the financial institutions and investments of the West. Despite this smear campaign, Traoré and his allies were proceeding with determination. As a first concrete step, direct trade agreements were signed between countries. Customs duties were removed. Border crossings were facilitated. The second step was to create a joint investment fund. Each country would transfer a certain percentage of its GDP to this fund, and these resources would be used in infrastructure, education, and health projects. This was the first step in reducing dependency on the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The third and perhaps boldest step was to begin preparations for a common currency. This currency, named Afri, was designed as an alternative to the franc and dollar. It would be backed by gold and other precious metals, thus gaining a strong value. 2 months later, at an economic conference in Paris, French President Pierre Dubois gave the first official reaction to Traoré's plan. "This initiative is dangerous for Africa's stability. France will take all necessary measures to protect the integrity of the franc zone." The same day in Burkina Faso, Traoré addressed the people. "Some powers are threatening us. They don't want our economic independence. But we will not step back. Africa's resources belong to the African peoples." As tensions escalated, an unexpected development occurred. China announced its support for the Pan-African Economic Cooperation model. The Chinese foreign minister visited Ouagadougou and signed a series of economic agreements with Traoré. "China supports Africa's search for economic independence," said the Chinese minister. "We are ready to deepen cooperation with African countries on the basis of equal partnership." This development worried Western powers. The increase in China's influence in Africa threatened their own interests. A strategy change was made. Instead of directly opposing, to sit at the negotiation table. IMF President Georgieva sent a letter to Traoré. "We understand your concerns. Perhaps it is time to reconsider our conditions. Please give an opportunity for dialogue." Traoré smiled when he received the letter. The plan was working. Western institutions now had to take them seriously. But the real goal was not to extract concessions, but to achieve a real system change. His answer to Georgieva was definitive. "We are always open to dialogue. However, not under the old conditions anymore. We should talk as equal partners, considering Africa's real needs. 6 months later, at a special session of the African Union in Addis Ababa, the Pan-African Economic Cooperation Model was officially adopted. Now, not 12, but 32 African countries had joined this model. Speaking at the meeting, Traoré said, "Today, we celebrate Africa's Economic Independence Day. We are at the beginning of a long road, but now we determine our own destiny." The same day, the African Development Bank launched the first Afri bonds. These bonds would be used to finance infrastructure projects in African countries. Unexpectedly, global investors showed great interest. On the first day, the demand was twice the targeted amount. "This is the first concrete success of Traoré's vision," wrote The Economist. "Perhaps it is time to rethink Africa's economic future." Even some analysts on Wall Street had begun to change their minds. The Pan-African model might be more sustainable than we initially thought, especially with the support of China and other emerging economies. A year later, the first concrete results began to be seen. The trade volume between African countries had increased by 30%. Infrastructure projects, education, and health investments were progressing rapidly. And most importantly, dependency on the IMF had decreased. Traoré, the architect of all these developments, had now become the symbol not just of Burkina Faso, but of all Africa. Time magazine selected him as Person of the Year. The cover story read, "The man who shook the global economy with a single silent protest." In Washington, D.C., a new meeting was being held in the Grand Conference Hall of the IMF headquarters. This time the agenda was different. New economic relations model with Africa. In the hall, Traoré and other members of the Pan-African Economic Cooperation Council were also present. But now they were not in the back rows, but at the main table. As equal partners, they were discussing the future of the global economy. Georgieva began her speech. "The events that took place in this hall last year marked the beginning of a new era in the global economy. President Traoré's bold exit forced us to think, to change. And today, we are here to discuss a new partnership model." When Traoré took the podium, the hall fell silent. Everyone wanted to listen to the architect of that unforgettable protest. "A year ago," Traoré began, "I left this hall. This was not a rejection, but an invitation. It was a call for Africa's economic independence. And today, I am happy to see that this call has been answered." Applause rose in the hall. Traoré continued, "Africa now wants to be a continent that cooperates, not one that receives aid. We have our resources, our potential, and most importantly, our vision. And we want to share this vision with the whole world." When the speech ended, IMF President Georgieva approached Traoré and extended her hand. "We have learned a lot from you, President Traoré, and I think we still have a lot to learn." Traoré shook her hand with a smile. "Learning is mutual, President Georgieva. We are also learning from you. What matters is that this learning process is between equals." Returning to Ouagadougou, Traoré was greeted by a large crowd at the airport. People saw him as the hero of Africa's economic independence. In his palace, he held an evaluation meeting with his close team. Successes and challenges were discussed. "The model is working," said Economy Minister Ouedraogo proudly. "Trade is increasing, investments are increasing, independence is increasing, but we still have a long way to go." Traoré nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, we are just at the beginning of the road. Western powers still want to keep us under control. China and other emerging economies are looking after their own interests. We, on the other hand, must think only of Africa's interests." "So, what's the next step?" asked Foreign Minister Zongo. Traoré looked out the window, watching the horizon of Ouagadougou. "The next step is to consolidate our economic independence, to fully implement the AFRI, to establish the African Central Bank, and most importantly, to raise the living standard of our people, because the purpose of all these efforts is their welfare." Zongo nodded, and all this began with a protest, with a single silent protest. Traoré smiled. "Sometimes the most powerful messages are delivered silently, Jean-Baptiste. What matters is the determination and vision behind that silence." That night, sitting on the balcony of his palace, Traoré looked at the stars. He thought about how the risk he had taken a year ago in Washington had changed the destiny of all Africa. A single decision, a single step, a single silent protest. And now Africa's journey to economic independence had begun. This journey would not be easy, but there was no turning back now. Africa was regaining its right to determine its own destiny. As Traoré looked at the stars in the sky, he remembered the words of his ancestors. True independence is not just in the flag and the anthem, but in the economy and the mines. And now Africa was moving toward independence, both in its economy and in its mines. This would be a long and difficult journey, but Traoré and leaders like him were ready to walk this path with determination. Because sometimes to change the world, all it takes is a single step, a single decision, a single silent protest.